Hey there guys, Spexy here, welcome back to RetroSpexx. I hope that you've been enjoying the content so far, and if you have any ideas for what you would like to see on the channel going forward, then please do tell me in the comment section below. I'll look forward to reading your comments and taking on board your feedback and suggestions. But today we are looking at the birth of the FPS, the first person shooter. So what was the very first FPS? Now I'm sure many of you would think you know the answer to this riddle, but I can assure you that it's not as simple or obvious as it would first appear. Most of the industry today would quote Wolfenstein 3D as the first first-person shooter ever. However, I'm going out on a limb here to disprove this theory, so let's get started. So obviously inspiration came from a multitude of other genres, most notably the shooters as mentioned in the very description of FPS, but what about the first person part? Well, we'd already experienced this as a pilot in many games like Star Wars from the arcade, which saw you flying your trusty X-Wing down the Death Star Trench, Battlezone, the Warframe tank simulation from Atari, and many others. But I will be excluding these as vehicles do not play a major role in what we now come to consider a true FPS. So vehicles aside, where does that leave us? Well, on foot, usually. So the player has to be on foot and view the world from a first person perspective. Now I've seen many a game that fits that description. How about Maze War in 1974, a wireframe first person maze game which arguably did involve some shooting. Or 3D Monster Maze on the ZX81, made somewhat amazingly considering the hardware limitations in 1981 by J.K. Gray Software. It saw the player desperately trying to escape a maze whilst being hunted down by a hungry T-Rex. And whilst this game's certainly first person, there's no shooting involved. It plays more akin to what we would now call a survival horror game. And maybe it was the very first survival horror game, who knows? But that's another episode. So at this time, the shooting games were evolving into yet more shooting games. It seems that apart from scrolling in different directions, not much had changed for them apart from the graphics of course. Meanwhile, however, in 3D Maze World, we had the emergence of the dungeon crawler, with Dungeon Master in 1987 by FTL, Blood Witch in 1989 by Microsoft, and Eye of the Beholder in 1990 by Westwood Studios, all of which offered first-person immersion, but these games were only pseudo-3D in terms of control. The player could turn around and move in each direction okay, but only one space at a time. You had no freedom to truly move or look around in a proper 3D environment. We had seen this, however, in a much earlier game by Atari called Way Out, involving a 3D maze, but this time you could rotate the camera freely as you searched for an escape route. Never had anyone shown the sheer audacity to combine these two things to make something truly incredible. That was all set to change though in 1990 as Paul Neurath began work on what would revolutionise not only the 3D dungeon genre of games, but also have a huge impact on the shooters of the future. That game was Ultima Underworld, the Stygian Abyss. And it gave players not only the freedom to move around their environment in a proper 3D sense, but also allowed us to experience our journey with fully textured surroundings. And it was mind-blowing. So what does this all have to do with FPS? Well, I'm sure you can begin to see some similarities between what I've shown you so far and what has been heralded the first-person shooter, Wolfenstein 3D. And that is because in October 1990, a certain John Romero of ID fame, after speaking to Paul Neurath, had learned of his texture mapping techniques and planned to use it in his own project, Wolfenstein 3D. Wait, what? Not Wolfenstein? No, not Wolfenstein. So whilst we cannot give credit to Ultima Underworld for being the first FPS, although it certainly does contain most of the elements, fully rendered 3D environments including slopes, which we had to wait some time before ever seeing again in an FPS title, Ultima Underworld predominantly is an RPG, and I will not take that away from it. The first ever true 3D RPG? Yes, probably, but not the daddy of FPS. So what is? In 1991, incidentally the same year that Origin released Ultima Underworld, thanks to the texture mapping knowledge of Paul Neurath and the innovation of John Romero, a now little remembered game emerged, and that game's name? Catacomb 3D. Now take a look for yourselves here guys, but I think you'll all agree that this looks an awful lot like an FPS as we now know it. Sprite based enemies, looking quite similar to the style that we would later see in games like Doom, the weapon hand at the bottom of the screen, something that almost all FPSs continue with to this day, and a health meter, depicted here as a head which turns into a skull as the player takes damage, rather than coming up a beaten nest a la Wolfenstein or Doom. It kind of reminds me of the Tic Attac's chicken carcass health meter, but maybe that's just me. So while the game is dungeon based like many of the maze games I mentioned already, it shared the textured surfaces from Ultima Underworld and the setting that is certainly more familiar with RPG players. This game is not an RPG or a maze game, rather this is a shooter. A bold statement? Maybe, but just bear with me here, the player shoots off spells, which seems quite RPG-y, right? but there's no real RPG feeling about the whole thing. In fact, it kind of feels more like you're shooting a gun at a multitude of varying enemies whose attack pattern and frequency are by no means RPG based. This is a shooter, dress it up as you like, but it's still a shooter, and being played from a first person perspective, it's certainly a contender. Now, interestingly enough, it also came out a good year before the release of Wolfenstein 3D, though still by the same company. Damn you, Romero, I couldn't take the credit away from ID, but hey ho. So, Catacomb 3D, I now declare you the first person shooter of all time, as we know it. Now, you may disagree with part or all of everything I've said in today's video, and if you do, well, that's just fine. Life would be boring if we all shared the same opinion, right? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and I'll be sure to ignore them. Thoughtfully take them into consideration. So, if you guys want to see more of my retro shenanigans, then don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Tell your friends about it, and maybe even send a tweet to the world. Who knows? But in any case, I hope you enjoyed it. So from me, Spexy, see you soon guys, and I look forward to looking backwards with you again in the next episode.